This is a steal for the Pittsburgh Penguins as they've made more signings, and one signing in particular will have Penguins fans absolutely fired up. And we also have an update on what's going on with Bryan Rust and all the trade rumors that have been surrounding him. We're going to break that all down in this episode of Penguins Digest. But before we do that, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. About 68% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel. So if you want to stay up to date with everything that's happening with your Pittsburgh Penguins, go down below, hit that free subscribe button because this is the place to be for all your daily Pittsburgh Penguins content. But before we get into Bryan Rust, we're going to touch on some more signings that the Pittsburgh Penguins have made, including one that happened 30 seconds before we started recording this video. But the big one we have to get to is Evgeni Malkin. Now, of course, this is a player, before we get into it and what he means for the Pittsburgh Penguins, who missed almost the entire season last year. He only played in 13 games and obviously was dealing with some injury problems. But he's a big, skilled centerman who can make a difference for this team. You could see he's a way better defensive player than he is offensively, so he's not going to give you too much offensively. He's still going to chip in for some points here and there, but a great two-way center is what I would call him. You can see here from JFresh, Evgeni Malkin has signed a 1-year, $2.5 million contract with Pittsburgh, which I think is pretty low for what he brings to the table and what he could have made somewhere else. But of course, I think the injury has something to do with it and what happened last year. But obviously, he is an efficient scorer with decent speed. He's also a big body who pushes play in the right direction. And like I keep mentioning, 6'5", 234 pounds, but plays a lot smaller than what he actually is. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, Mark. He still uses his size to his advantage, but he has that speed and he has that skill. So what do you make of this signing? I think this is a really good one and an underrated one. And I'm actually surprised he fell right into the Penguins' lap because this is a really good guy to play alongside some of the youngsters and to learn from.
I think the biggest thing is just a couple of years removed from a 20-goal season.
Yep.
I think Mantha still has a lot to give. This was a very injury-riddled season. That's a tongue twister. Going into last year, and not a lot of teams got to have a look at what he could do or what he could do for the franchise. So I think, and this is the major trend with Dubas, we're getting a lot of low risk, high rewards. I would not be shocked if Mantha's a guy to play on the wing of Sidney Crosby, to get back into his groove. He scored 20 goals before with a lot less better line mates than Sidney Crosby, who is the best player of our generation and top 5, top 3 all time, maybe even the best. Sorry, Wayne. But I do think Mantha has a chance to bounce back. If he can score you 20 goals, if he can go out and get back into his groove, I actually really like this signing and genuinely think it might be one of the most underrated, not only for the Penguins, but across the league so far.
I totally agree with that. I think this is a super underrated signing. Like Chell Penguins makes a point of here right at the end. Obviously, last season he only played in 13 games, but he had 7 points in those 13 games, so that's not bad if you're getting half a point a game, points from this player. And depending how he fares this season, like you mentioned, maybe he plays with Sidney Crosby, maybe he's playing higher up just to get back in the swing of things, maybe he is playing center on the third line, something like that. But he could be a piece that fetches more draft capital at this year's trade deadline. A lot of teams love this player and want him for a playoff run, and we've seen it in previous years. So again, it didn't happen last year, but we've seen it in years past. So I think it could be actually a very good option for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And you can see here he's an advanced analytic darling, I guess, to a degree because of his role, but he's had a lot of ups and downs. He's on a 1-year deal. It's $2.5 million, really nothing for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and you can retain some salary cap if you end up trading him at the trade deadline. It looks like a lot of people are projecting that he's going to be a trade chip at the deadline. So very smart move, another good one from Kyle Dubas. He's going to be able to produce for you, you would assume, throughout the season. Then of course, if you're not going to make the playoffs, then you can trade him at the deadline. So some pretty good work there from Kyle Dubas. And you can see here still $15 million to work with, $15.7 million to work with on the salary cap. And this is kind of what the lineup's looking like right now. I don't think this is complete. You got Mantha on the right wing there on the third line. Pretty interesting. We know that Brazeau signed as well. We had another video on that. Blomqvist is now the backup goaltender. And of course, I think he shored up the defense pretty well. Not bad. Obviously, Graves needs to have a good season for all of this to come together, but having Connor Clifton and Parker Witherspoon down there, not bad. The all Bruins third pairing there, I guess, that both of them came over from the Boston Bruins, but don't mind the signing at all. And speaking of another signing that I don't mind at all, Raphael Harvey-Pinard, who I thought was going to be a for life Montreal Canadian, or at least in their system, but not the case. He is now a Pittsburgh Penguin. But Mark, it's very interesting. It's a two-way contract. This is a guy who is already 26 years old, is a smaller forward, hasn't really figured it out to make the NHL. He's had some stints, right, and has shown flashes of brilliance, but this is a guy I'm not, necessarily too excited about. I would imagine he's going to be playing for the Baby Pens and, be an AHL player. Maybe if there's some injuries, we'll see him in the NHL, but I don't expect too much out of him.
I think the biggest thing is we've seen a couple of years ago with the Montreal Canadiens, speaking to Habs Digest Josh Goss on it, he came up during a very injury-riddled season for the Habs, got into the top six, and actually did put up decent numbers, but this was very much you throw him into the top line. He gelled well and hasn't really done a lot since then. I do think it's a depth signing, but I do think there's still a tiny bit there with this guy that maybe he comes in, performs, gets into that top six, and you don't want him in your top six. And no hate to this guy, but I do think there might be a bit of value. And if you need to plug him into this lineup, it's not the end of the world, but I do not expect this to be a home run signing for the Penguins. For Scranton, yes, but not for the Penguins organization.
Absolutely. I don't think so. And again, he's going to go down, probably produce some good numbers in the AHL, but I don't foresee him, really figuring it out at this point at the NHL level. And again, he's a smaller forward, but does bring some skill. And if there are some injuries, can probably slot into the NHL lineup. And like I mentioned, it's all kind of coming together now. I do wonder about Bryan Rust, and I want to get into that now. This is from Kelsey. This is not a commentary on whether or not the Penguins should trade Rust. Dubas has made it clear that he would for the right price. And as we know, Bryan Rust, the way his contract is set up, he makes just over $5 million, and his no movement clause is gone at this point. There's no more no movement clause. You can trade him if the Pittsburgh Penguins want to, but obviously Dubas wants a fairly big return. You can see here that she continues, but I think many falsely assume that Dubas' only reason for keeping Rust around are nostalgia and leadership. There's bigger context to it, and we can get into this now. That she went on to say, everyone has already rolled with the assumption that the plan is for this team to not compete for 5+ years, which I don't think is actually the plan. I feel like they do want to compete within that 5-year window, especially with Sidney Crosby being in his late 30s already. I think that has clouded people's assessment of the Rust Raquel situation, because Raquel is another one who had a career year last year. And Dubas has also said multiple times, by the way, over the last little while in press conferences and media availabilities, that he wants the team to return to contention as urgently as possible. It's not the 5-year thing, or they're not going to compete for 5 years, as fast as possible. And you have to consider the fact that perhaps Dubas sees the Penguins competing again before Rust's contract expires. He might see value in keeping him to bridge that gap. So I definitely agree with that. I mean, Bryan Rust is a guy who scored 30 goals last year, right? I know he's playing with Sidney Crosby, and maybe I could score 10 goals playing beside Sidney Crosby, but that's a maybe. I don't think that's probably possible at this point. But, he scored 30 goals in the NHL. He's a really good player. So what do you make of this situation? I think it's very interesting. I think there's more to it than even what we've been talking about, which is obviously the leadership, keeping him around for some of the younger guys, and you still need goal scoring. I think there's a little bit more to that.
I think there's a lot of value keeping Rust. Same with Raquel. You have two guys that are performing very well with Sidney Crosby. I think Dubas is sitting in the point of you have two guys that want to stay here, that have produced, that Crosby plays well with. But if you get a home run package for either of these guys, if someone's looking at 30-year-old Bryan Rust and saying, hey, we'll give you a first, an A-level prospect, and maybe a roster player, I feel like you have to do it. But it's one of those trades you keep them unless you get a wow factor trade where you would be fired for not accepting.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be interesting to continue to follow what's going on with Bryan Rust in that situation, because of course there was a lot made out of Bryan Rust and his no movement clause kind of going away around July 1st and at the draft and all of that, and the fact that the Penguins could have made a trade happen then, because they would say, listen, if we're going to trade you anyway, just agree to the trade essentially. But there was a lot made out of that, but it doesn't seem very likely at this point. The last thing I want to mention before we wrap up here is Alexander Alexeyev from the Washington Capitals. The Pittsburgh Penguins have just signed him. He was a UFA after not being qualified by Washington. He's a 25-year-old left shot defenseman, and he's signed to a 1-year league minimum contract. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Another depth signing for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He only played a handful of games for the Washington Capitals, so something to monitor as well. But let us know in the comments how you feel about this signing, how you feel about Anthony Mantha as well. I'll bring up his stats. He didn't do too much last year. Again, injury-riddled season for him, but he's 30 years old. I feel like he's ready to get back on track. Let us know how you feel about that. And of course, the whole Brian Rust situation as well. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with everything Pittsburgh Penguins.